Good morning. Welcome to the BIM RC21, our first panel, The Dawn of 6G Business, Are We Facing a Positive Disruption? My name is Petri Ahokangas. I'm the Professor of Future Digital Business at Oulu Business School, University of Oulu, and I'm working for the 6G flagship in the area of 6G, 5G transition. The program today will be that I'll be starting with a couple of introductory slides. Then we have short videos of the panelists, and then introducing the panelists a little bit better, and then we go into the discussion. And towards the end of the show, we will have the Q&A session where everybody can have the opportunity to ask questions. May I have the slides, please? All right, very good. So just briefly going into the backgrounding of the 6G transition from 5G towards something that we don't know yet from the business perspective. And the focus of today is to discuss about the business disruption and how we can actually conceive this disruption, what kind of things we are expecting to change, what kind of new business opportunities we are facing, or what kind of new stakeholders might be coming into the play when we talk about 5G, 6G in general, what kind of new services could be there, and then especially how these business models might be as we go towards 6G by 2030. In this panel, we will discuss and identify, shed light to different factors that we think will influence 6G business, provide an outlook, how to scale and replicate new solutions across different use cases, markets, and customer segments in a way that would be not only economically feasible, but also societally and environmentally feasible. And then probably identify some possible bottlenecks and options regarding different regulatory issues arising around 6G. So this is a general starting point for the discussion. The reason why we think it's important is actually something that we found already earlier this year when Vodafone was sharing this news where they said that, yes, there will be 1 million private 5G networks by 2030 all in Europe. And if that kind of a change will take place, that is a huge paradigm change for the way how things are going to be in 5G. And then the question is that how will that be in 6G is another question. And as we see here a transition, then we are at something new. We have already in our earlier research been looking at different scenarios of 6G. And I think that we have different levels on which we can identify these new phenomena coming. We have new kinds of customer experience. We have different kind of business strategies emerging. Sustainability in many ways is emerging as a new issue, and then there are a lot of geopolitical discussions and things influencing the way how we scale and replicate different solutions across markets. There's also the AI, and when we combine AI and 6G together, then we face the problem how to profit from innovation. And the traditional way of commercializing technology through discrete technologies that are protected by single patents held by single companies. And then when we go to 6G, the question is that are we really going from enabling technologies that have radical change on industry levels onto something that we could call general purpose technologies that could have fundamental change to economies and societies. So the question is that is this going to be the future? That 6G will be this kind of multi-purpose technology the same way as steam engine and change the whole society in different ways. So maybe that is also how we see the business and what kind of business opportunities are coming from there. So 6G has been listed to have different kind of use cases. Ubiquitous unlimited connectivity for human and machine users. It will probably influence the way how we enjoy privacy, security and safety in these services. It will bring massive twinning and sustainability solutions available. And then when we look at the impact of the 6G at the user, business, sustainability, or geopolitics level, then we have the big picture there. But let's look forward to this discussion and go to look how things are in these videos uploaded by the panelists before the conference. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you for coming today. I'm Seppo Yrjölä from Nokia, and I'm looking forward to discussing with you today about the dawn of 6G business. Did you know that radio access covers up to 84% of standard essential patents in 5G, and that the device relevancy of all the SEPs has been over 80%? This agrees with the distribution of licenses and license royalties we've been seeing. During my short introduction today, I'll provide you with some background on themes relevant to profiting from technology innovation in the 6G era, how to capture value from all the innovations we in the wireless engineering community are creating. In the 6G era, where the convergence of wireless and internet technologies will drive digital economy and automation across industries, the focus of innovation will shift from individual technology or product towards innovation within platforms and ecosystems. To make sense of future digital economy, we must envision 6G systems in a multidisciplinary way, from technology, business, policy, societal perspective, as an emerging, shall we say, kind of general purpose platform and technology, defined as being omnipresence, having potential for continuous technical improvements and enabling innovational complementarities across industry sectors. Mobile network operators have been the focal point of mobile communication business studies, where the prevailing techno-economic perspective has mainly focused on connectivity service provisioning, and networks seen as enabling technology, or shall I say kind of engineering platform with broad application base. The ongoing convergence of mobile communication network with the digital platforms from various web-scale cloud service providers has triggered studies on mobile business at the ecosystem level through the lenses of ecosystemic business models. My findings on capturing value from the technological innovation in 6G displays the importance of appropriability, complementarity, standardization, and intellectual property IPs. Appropriability may be a challenge due to the anticipated role of the 6G as an upstream general-purpose technology. This calls for multidisciplinary approach with proactive business model innovation stemming from understanding the particularities of relevant complements and supportive regulatory and policy environment. Spectrum to mention one, like net neutrality. Complementary assets and embedded technologies lie at the core of 6G ecosystem structures around several competing and intersecting digital platforms layers. Platforms and standardization allow modularization and autonomous innovation from various stakeholders. Open communities enable firms to convert a distributed resource like open source software into complementary asset in 6G. On the other hand, open architecture and modularity may challenge the ability of the ecosystem to generate systemic innovation with highest value capture potential. Collaborative standard development process has enabled massive downstream innovation in mobile technology and application ecosystem, as we have all witnessed. Towards 6G, the current value capture mechanisms from the lower layer radio functions in silicon and physical layer algorithms will be extended towards higher layer enabling technologies, such as augmented intelligence and human-machine interface related technologies. New innovations from converging information and communication technology application domains will challenge the entire layered technology standardization and licensing model centered around radio access. By expanding the circle of stakeholders and licensees, the introduction of 6G will lead to an increasingly complex licensing landscape and necessitate a novel, more precise rule for FRAND compliant licensing. As we all know, traditional way to retain and capture value from mobile technology innovation has been patents and licensing, and particularly via standard essential patents, SEP portfolio cross-licensing. The value capture potential of complementary assets in the 6G may be compromised as they will increasingly present an embedded role to make the technology platform and ecosystem to function in general. The mobile communication business will be transformed beyond connectivity toward cloud-based delivery, software-led value creation, and network-as-a-service business model across telecommunication, internet, enterprise, and industrial domains. 6G networks will be designed, deployed, managed, and put into market not only by the traditional mobile network operators or communication service providers, but new stakeholders like local operators, cloud operators, and various neutral hosts. The pervasive influence of service-driven logic in 6G means to meet the diverse needs and preferences of each user or specialized 6G subnetworks, whether human, physical machine, or digital twin. To gain a full potential and capture value from technology innovations in 6G, it is essential that regulators protect the intellectual property contribution to incentivize R&D investments by the developers of open collaborative enabling technologies. Furthermore, innovations may increasingly require access to new technology-related infrastructures as public complementary assets. Thank you for your time and looking forward to discussing these themes more in details in the coming panel.
My name is Paul Timmers. I will talk today about dilemmas of disruptive 6G, dilemmas that we better resolve today. My first dilemma is the decentralization of security versus the techno-state. With 6G and already with 5G, any company can run its own network. It could be a manufacturing plant, it could be a festival organizer. With that, the responsibility is also on making sure that these networks are secure. Things are to be protected: industrial data, the personal data of the festival participants, the availability, the continuity of the service. Imagine just if, for example, a festival network would get hacked and spoofed messages create a crowd panic. The public security risk is very serious. So security has to be taken seriously, but are the companies that are running these networks in the future actually capable of doing so? And they will have legal obligations too, legal obligations that today are only reserved for the larger network providers under the law, such as the EU's Network Directive. Now, such decentralized security fits very well with the decentralization paradigm of 6G, which is supposed to bring many economic and social benefits. But if decentralization of security fails, we risk swinging towards a centralized control and surveillance. And the perspective that we have then ahead of us is that of a dystopian techno-state as we see emerging in China today. My second dilemma is about international standardization, that we need to get right or we risk the death of global standards. In fact, global standardization in telecommunications has become very politicized. Governments no longer can really trust or have shown not to really trust what the industry is delivering in terms of standards, that it sufficiently respects national security and sovereignty, that it can withstand infiltration and hacking that has become much more sophisticated today, that there is supplier choice that reduces dependencies when there are geopolitical tensions. I think that it's not sure that industry on its own can do the job to deliver the global standards in 6G that we need tomorrow. I think we may need a new contract between industry, civil society, and governments. A new contract for global standardization that respects rules and requirements, gives every of these parties a seat at the table, and together engenders trust. Finally, then, my third dilemma is to look beyond 6G or risk that 6G becomes a genie escaping from the bottle. What I mean by beyond is not beyond that 6G is beyond 5G and that we will be talking about 7G. I really mean looking beyond the box of technology, standards, and business models that we normally think about when we say 6G. It means looking at the global challenges where 6G will play a role, like climate change, persistent poverty, and global health scares. It means also thinking about the relationship between technology and the society in which we live. The technological construction that we do with 6G will influence very much and will be influenced very much by the social construction of the laws and the governance of the future, by the norms and behaviors that our children will have to live with, by the way we look at life and work. I do not know of a systematic analysis or assessment that makes us understand how technology choices that we make today are related to the social choices of tomorrow. But I think we need together to build that kind of understanding. Otherwise, 6G will indeed become a genie that escapes from the bottle. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Georg Serentschy. I advise companies and organizations in the ICT sector on regulatory and technology issues. I'm going to talk about disruption from 6G in relation to 5G and leave it to the debate whether it's positive or negative for society and industry and what we can do to make it as positive as possible. I see three areas for disruption: technology, policy and regulatory issues, and society. Let's first go to technology. What will drive disruption in the field of technology? Wireless ubiquitous connectivity, very small cells, millimeter wave bands, etc. Devices, not only smartphones, also wearables of all kind, massive IoT, etc. Distributed and edge computing to deliver ultra-fast real-time information. Demand from verticals will drive a boom for campus and private networks. For example, a new report from Vodafone entitled Powering Up Manufacturing, Leveling Up Britain suggests that 5G could be a game changer for the UK industry. Improved efficiency and higher productivity achieved through smart manufacturing processes will add up to €7.3 billion to the UK economy by 2030. Application areas like health, mobility, industrial production, energy production and storage, and transport. And finally, cybersecurity aspects becoming even more important because of the massively increasing attack surfaces. Post-quantum cryptography will leave the academic sphere and become an industrial imperative. The second part is policy and regulatory issues for the transition from 5G to 6G. How we can secure global supply chain against the backdrop of growing tensions between China and the US? Will the concept of open strategic autonomy be the means for Europe to increase its digital sovereignty? How can we better manage the impact of ICT, in particular video streaming, on greenhouse gas emissions and on electricity consumptions? Will Open RAN become a game changer in the network operator-vendors relationship? Where will be the new bottlenecks? How are the European communications technology industry and research developing regarding the virtualization of communications networks? And finally, what could an industrial research and policy framework for the communication technologies of the future look like? The third part is society. It's about the digitalization of all areas, new network paradigms, new teaching and learning, impact from universal 6G-enabled digitalization on socioeconomic structures, future jobs, hybrid working, AI-empowered systems and the impact on society, mental and physical health, entertainment, and leisure time. To conclude, there are a plethora of things already underway which can be seen as disruptions from 6G in relation to 5G. Not all of them will be positive for all stakeholders, but managing the disruption will be a key task for policymakers, industry, and academia. Thank you.
All right, very good. We have heard the videos and seen the videos, and let's start by briefly introducing a little bit better our panelists. So let's start in reverse order compared to the videos. We have first Georg Serentschy from Austria, and he has background in industry, in consultancy business, and as a regulatory authority, and currently working in his own business. And I think that, Georg, you can also introduce yourself a little bit better. Then we have Paul Timmers. He's currently working at the European University Cyprus, also a research associate at Oxford University, and has a history as a director at the European Commission. And you, Paul, if you want to share a little bit more detail about your background and experience. And the third one that we have in the panel is Seppo Yrjölä, coming from Nokia Corporation. He's been building radios from 1G onwards, and he's also working as the professor of practice at the University of Oulu in the field of techno-economics or future wireless communications. I want to welcome our panelists to the discussion, and I think that we can start with this kind of a brief, if you want to add something on what you want to share about yourself for the audience. Who will start? Georg?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Happy to kick off this live part of the discussion. With regards to my background and what I'm doing, there is not much to add what I've already said in the video. My most important point is I'm combining a scientific background from nuclear physics, so that's many years, decades back, with my industry experience, consulting experience, and hands-on regulatory experience. And I'm combining all this as an advisor for regulatory, competition, and spectrum issues in my advisory boutique now. So that's all what I can say in a nutshell. And I think this the subject of this conference is very timely, very topical, and we have many things ahead of us, and a couple of bifurcations which deserve a lot of thinking and a lot of discussion.
Thank you, Georg. And then Paul.
Yeah, let me add a few words, and actually picking up on something that Seppo said about 6G to illustrate a little bit my interest and background. So Seppo talked about it that in 6G we are really talking about a multidisciplinary approach, and actually quite the broad in terms of the economic, social, and environmental objectives. And my own experience, especially in working in the European Commission in developing digital policy in areas like cybersecurity, digital identity, the rollout of services like electronic ID and the regulations around it, and also recently in more academic work, is that we are not going to get away by taking a myopic single disciplinary view on 6G. And it's truly very challenging because it means that people with the technology background need to think about, for example, law. People with a law background need to think about the human aspect and how people experience it. And we all need to gather to think about what this will do for the planet. And we just don't have all of the ready-made experience and tools available to do this type of multidisciplinary thinking. But in my view, it's a condition sine qua non, and we perhaps have a good starting point because many of us probably feel that we need to go in that direction based upon our years of experience, as also in my case in in public policy, in academia, and in business.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And Seppo.
To continue what Paul said, really this interdisciplinary, or even one could call it transdisciplinary approach, that what we want as humans, what societies want, what machines want, and all of us together as an ecosystem. And what I'm really focusing currently is as well this sustainability development challenge. And quite often as engineers or radio engineers, we only focus on the energy or the environmental or the material substances, but as well to expand and enlarge this discussion to societal sustainability and economic sustainability. And that's really drives me at work as a principal engineer in Nokia, as well as a academic studying techno-economics and business side of the story.
All right, very good. I think we have a very good group of panelists representing different kind of fields. I myself come from the business school side. I've been looking at the societal impact and business models and ecosystems in the 5G, 6G field for the past 10 years. And before that, I was working in the telecom test and measurement industry. So that gives me some kind of technical background also these issues. But my role here is to moderate the discussion, and then I'm looking forward to also receiving very good questions from the audience that you can share in the chat. Great. So let's start the discussion. And I was thinking to start with something that is related to the positive and potentially negative aspects on the 6G transition. But let's start on the positive side. So what do you see as the biggest new business opportunities when we are moving from 5G to 6G? Who would like to start on this positive side of the 6G? Seppo.
Perhaps
Paul
okay?
raised hand first.
Yeah, Paul, that I start, Petri. I mean, let me just say a few words. It's kind of interesting in 6G that we are talking at this stage about a vision and perhaps a mission that we have, like realizing the SDGs, but we are not yet there in terms of seeing our overall strategy and the technical developments and business model developments that will underpin that. But there is this kind of broad vision that we will have information and communication available everywhere at a high density. There is the omnipresence, I think Seppo also used that word, surrounded, immediacy, interconnection, integration that we will achieve, SDGs that can be realized, democratization as a matter of fact of access to network and communication technology. And this then coupled with this information density, where artificial intelligence will help us and digital twins will be a model that I find really intriguing. So I think it's rather kind of a wide-ranging, very ambitious vision that we see being presented here without us actually knowing the opportunities exactly and the consequences. So we are kind of, in a certain sense, trying to envisage here a future while actually also building that vision. So it's rather uncertain ground, but that's free. That's the stage we are in. I think there are I find two particular business opportunities very intriguing. I guess there must be a lot of room for new intermediaries that can help us to manage these million networks and to connect actually the networks that are that are then going to be moved to the business users rather than the providers, to help them as business users to work with these networks that are omnipresent and that are ad hoc. So new intermediaries. And the other one, I think this whole idea of the digital twin in this environment is very intriguing too, because that on the one hand relates to the individual objects and items that we have that are connected in the 6G environment. And on the other hand, it relates to the 6G environment itself as a digital twin. In a certain sense, we are going to live inside 6G. That's kind of the idea there. And that's, I think, also a tremendous opportunity. But that also, let me also mention here the but, if you allow me, Petri, right away. So, or consideration rather. So with so many more opportunities and so much more information, we actually know from sociological studies, for example, when people have many choices, they will have to limit their choices. And how do they do that? They do that by developing norms, social norms in particular. And social norms imply values. And then the question becomes, who is aware of these values, who provides these values and norms, who's the one that does that? And that's a process that we are in at this moment about the desirable type of business models, for example. And also the potential downsides or risks of that, that this is captured by some of the very big existing players, like the platform players of today, or by the ones that are promoting a techno-state, like we see this dystopian move by China happening. So I think that we are at the same time in a very positive debate about opportunities and in a very perhaps concerning debate about what are the norms, and I'm really talking about social norms and values that are going to be that we are going to live with in the future. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. I think also that these ethics issues are arising more and more into discussion in here. Very good. Would like to comment here.
Yeah, to continue from Paul said about massive dynamic twinning and digital twins, as well as this ubiquitous or immersive services. And as we remember, we've been talking about connecting people and in 5G, the verticals and enterprise connectivity or connecting things, Internet of Things has been high on the agenda. And I think that now in 6G is really kind of connecting these things and humans and to create kind of multi-sensory application, immersive services. And not just connecting, but then as well how to say English word, kind of empowerment or empower as users that we are in control on what's happening. It relates to privacy, security, and safety. And one word mentioned already several times, how to create trust. And this leads to what we've been studying as well, is this legitimation of newness, that new technology, new disruptive technology, how to make it legitimate happen. So but about new business opportunities, really how to connect humans and machines, and not just to connect, but then build on top of content, context awareness, and commerce. And one thing that there will be a lot of different marketplaces, new type of platforms, and moving from platforms more to ecosystem, how all these things work together in a society. And as said earlier as well, this public-private partnership, that the societies and municipals and governments have much stronger role in 6G as we move towards more general purpose technology across different industries and parts of society.
Okay. Very good. How would you comment, George?
Yeah, I think a lot has been said already, and I'm not so sure what are the positive elements and the not so positive elements. It can be both, actually. It's many things are two sides of the same medal, so to say. I think what I would add here is two things. The one is what already was in the intro, that the demand from verticals will drive it. There will be a drive boom for campus and private networks. And Vodafone published a lot of things about this because they know it's about their core business. So for me, the key question here is, will 6G or the transition from 5G to 6G show the end of the network operators' monopoly to provide connectivity? And will private networks, industrial networks, become a new paradigm? For me, this question is not answered yet. Of course, telecom operators will heavily defend their turf, but private operators will come and will set up industrial plants or business units, maybe schools, university, whatsoever. The second thing which I found very interesting is if we look at the current network loads, currently in the foreseeable future, the network killer app is video streaming. And this raises two questions. The one is, we all know Netflix and co creates requires a lot of electricity consumption and creates greenhouse gas emissions. So under a green network paradigm, what does it mean? Can that be solved by a general CO2 tax? I think that's an unproven assumption. And because Netflix, of course, or any other, Amazon Prime or whatsoever, can come and say, okay, our whole network, our content delivery network is powered up by wind energy or by any renewable thing. But there is another negative externality, and it's totally unrelated with the CO2 issue. And that's the cost caused by network congestion. So what have network operators to do and to undertake to mitigate the network congestion? And I think that is still in flux. So I guess this will be an area of future research.
Mm. There's actually quite a lot of discussion now on the verticals and their role in 5G and towards 6G. Would you have any guesses that what kind of industries would first be the beneficiaries of this transition towards private and local services? Any comments on this? The choice of industries.
It's perhaps a bit hard to say, but I would think that there is a number of industries that, and in particular those that are circling around Industry 4.0, that are having natural dense network requirements as well as dense information requirements, so where concepts like digital twins are already also developing. So I would think that in those kind of industries we can see quite interesting say pre-6G or 6G type of pilots. Possibly also in kind of the somewhat more complex logistics environments where we are where we are indeed talking about integration of a set of services. Again, people also talked about it, that we see integration of a number of sectors and services happening, such as between transport and customs. Those kind of combinations might also be suitable for early, as it is mentioned in the chat, 5G++ and 6G.
Very good. Other guesses, ideas on this? Who will be the first ones? Seppo, do you have any ideas on that to share?
I think we mentioned already Industry 4.0 and physical industries. I think in common, the challenge is this productivity, of course, efficiency and safety as well. So manufacturing, logistics, whether it's harbors or ports, then mining industry, definitely one. Different, not just the kind of harbors as ports, but airports, logistics, campus areas, others, and there one could say that this is a kind of long tail type of challenge or problem, that there will be many different users and application, and that creates the design challenge for 5G evolution and 6G, that how to enable this kind of long tail of different users and services. And this comes to this machine learning or AI or really autonomous network management, and how to orchestrate and manage this kind of networks or systems, and that will be one challenge. At the same time, when we are opening interfaces, we are opening architectures, we are kind of inviting an introduction, new stakeholders, new players, new complementers into the ecosystem. But there will be many, and as well, the question is, and maybe later we will discuss who is the operator of the future. There will be plenty of different operators, and what's the role of web scales and platforms of today in the future, who is operating, let's say, the bare metal or physical networks, who is operating the connectivity, who is operating context and services and or this kind of commercial platforms. So that's really fascinating research topic.
That's a very, very valid point, Seppo. I mean, who will be the operator of the future? And I think what we will see and will we observe, maybe already started, is the erosion of the monopoly role of the traditional network operators.
Very good. I think that the common element in these discussions is the increasing role of the ecosystem in many ways, and that kind of a fragmentation of the positions and who has the power in the network. But let's come to this kind of discussion also a bit later when we talk more about the ecosystemic side of these things. We started with the positive things, and I think that we were at the same time being hinting towards some kind of negative side effects or risks or bottlenecks here. So if you think about these barriers or bottlenecks that we are facing in this transition, how would you highlight them in practice?
I would say it's the lack of standardization. I mean, if the standardization on a global scale is not sufficient, industry, economy, society will not be able to leverage the benefits, the socioeconomic benefits from ubiquitous connectivity. And the danger that we will not have the internet as we know it in 6G because of initiatives coming from China to separate the internet, or Russia tried it, or a couple of others as well. I think it's a big issue.
So you see this kind of informational barriers emerging from the industries. Okay, very good.
And George,
perhaps I can react a little bit to that, to what Georg says. So I fully agree. Indeed, standardization is this kind of bottleneck, and we need to resolve that both in terms of the contents, what are we actually standardizing, and also in the way how are we standardizing, who's at the table, those kind of things. So we may get to that. But perhaps about the what, perhaps it's still something before that. I'm not quite sure whether we have clarity on the technological architectures that are underpinning 6G. Also because we have such broad expectations about what 6G can do in terms of ubiquity and availability and stability and processing power, and you mentioned, for example, congestion, etc., security. So we'll need a certain choices for architectures, and we all know that architectures are ultimately also implying certain ways of managing the technology and the opportunities that are there. And we see it already, in past examples about, say, the architecture of the cloud. The way you do that suits itself for ever more integration, and no wonder that you end up with a governance that is centered around some of the very big players. At the same time, we want to stimulate innovation, open competition, and all of that. So there's also something that is almost like a consequence of the choice of architecture. And I was also intrigued by a comment that Seppo made, that he said that interoperability and standardization may not always be quite good for systemic innovation or open. Actually, you said rather that open source, open standards, and interoperability may not always be good for systemic innovation. So I think we have these architectural choices, and perhaps Seppo can in a minute also react to this, but these architectural choices, I must say they are not clear to me what they are and what the impact of these architectural choices is on the type of business ecosystem and governmental governance, governmentalism that we will have on 6G.
Very good. Seppo, you had
I was about to continue on George's comment on standardization, and that's in my briefing. I discuss about this, how to profit from technology innovation, and in our industry and radio colleagues, we know that it's been very focused on physical layers, layer 1, layer 2, run type of standard essential patents. And now towards 6G, it will be like discussed systemic innovation, layered technology, new stakeholders entering, requirements from other industries, other stakeholders. So, and this is more like a question, I do not have answer, how to ensure that we incentivize innovators as radio engineers and companies to continue working on radio innovation in this new environment. And as we have seen that in many countries and regions, there's a very high grants and funding from governments on 6G, and really see that this is as well important for the competitiveness of different nations or regions, and how to think this kind of new way of public-private partnership here, starting from the really essential technology innovation, and then how to possibly revisit the standard essential patenting and this licensing model. That's one interesting topic to study.
Yeah, when I'm reflecting,
and might be a challenge.
Well, I'm reflecting your comments. I'm kind of seeing this kind of growing importance of this governance, maybe even geopolitics in between. But there's a lot of data regulation related things, for example, that are influencing the way how we consider, well, who owns the data, where it is stored, who have access to that, how do we regulate that kind of things. So it kind of fundamentally boils down to the values of the society that is directing the whole development here. And I think that this leads to this idea that we are using UN SDGs, the United Nations Social Development Goals, as the kind of attractor for the different development streams that we see at the moment.
Petri, may I make an additional comment here, or perhaps also a question? The focus here is on what is it that the industry needs to do, and then the question is, of course, also what is the industry? Who are we actually talking about? Seppo was referring here to what do we do in radio innovation, and that's a specific part of the industry. But we were also just saying that there is a major expectation that there is a strong involvement in 6G, and we see it already in 5G with, for example, the internet platforms, to mention those. There might even be an involvement in an emerging digital twins industry that likely is anyway going to be stimulated, for example, by things like circular economy. Or let me mention another one, as we all expect that AI not only will play a major role, has to play a major role. Who's providing the AI? Who's really good at AI? Perhaps that's a central point also of an industry that will contribute here. Let me mention an example that I know a bit better. There's a lot of AI used, for example, in the field of cybersecurity for monitoring very large networks and very complex systems that are effectively modeled in a digital twin fashion and checked for attacks, disturbances, worrying signals with the help of AI, which, by the way, has to react real time. And so that's not only AI that makes you think a little bit about what do you think about it. No, that's autonomous AI that starts to decide already on reconfiguring systems on the fly in order to fend off an attack. So that's also a whole body of experience that is there. That's also an industry that is coming up. And I don't know how that's actually getting organized, but I guess kind of with the vision of 6G fits that all of these industries have a role to play in the innovation that is needed, and ultimately also contributing to these standards, for example, that are needed. But the panelists may have a different view on that.
Yeah. Georg and Seppo, do you have something to comment on this?
To continue what you mentioned, the word data, and that's really the key. That's the access to data, who owns the data, how the data is utilized. And I think one of the key changes already in 5G evolution, but 6G, is that 6G is a massive immersive sensor in itself. We talk about using radio as a radar type of. And it's not just that 6G is a carrier for data, that's important, or connecting AI, connecting edges, but as well 6G in itself will create enormous amount of data. Another question is how to utilize this data. And that's one opportunity as well to definitely to create value. And then the question is once again, who will capture the value and how to capture the value in different layers. And this comes to where we started in introduction about these different 4C layers, from connectivity to content, context, and commerce. And I think in 6G business, we should kind of take all these C's into consideration to create a successful business model.
And that connects with another very important issue, and that's the policy and regulatory angle. What is allowed, I mean, to bring a kind of geopolitical aspect here in the discussion, what is allowed for European players in comparison to players in China or the US, how to utilize this data, how to leverage the value which is in those data. And what I hear here and there permanently is European industry, European operators massively limited by the European rules to leverage the value of those data, so that Europe, or to be more precise, the European Union is a world leader in regulation and in setting up policies, but is not that good in leveraging these technologies. So I think that's a very important geopolitical angle. It's a very important policy and regulatory matter, which is deeply embedded in these issues about the utilization of data. I don't have an answer to that, but I think this is one of the issues we are really facing. What can we do? What is allowed? And how can we better make use of the value of data without intruding too much into the personal rights of people.
Yeah, there are lots of this kind of fundamental issues related here. I think that we have had a very good discussion on the starting point on the positive and negative sides of this thing, and I think that we already touched my next question, that would be on the role of the platforms. That was already briefly mentioned here, and we're really seeing that the role of the ecosystems and platforms, not only ecosystems that are built around the platforms, but any kind of ecosystems that are there utilizing connectivity, digital twins, whatever we have here in connection of 6G. So my question to keep on this positive industry development side would be that what kind of new complementary platform or ecosystem roles you expect to emerge in 6G? We already discussed about this brokering or this kind of intermediary things that Paul was mentioning in his page, but would you elaborate a bit on that? What kind of complementary platform ecosystem roles do you see there as possible or possibly emerging in the future?
Thanks, Petri. At least to start with, that being in an engineering and radio conference, so we engineers typically think platforms as, shall I call it, innovation platform, where we have elements and how we connect things, kind of interfaces, APIs, and elements or components. And now clearly moving towards 6G, we should add discussion on the content, meaning data, as well as how to compute, how to automate using AI and machine learning. So already this kind of engineering or innovation type of platform thinking is expanded. And then coming from the internet side of platform thinking, it's really about how you connect needs and resources, demand and supply. And then we talk about transactional platforms. And I think in 6G, we have at the same time think about this innovation platform, transaction platform, and how these fits together. And that's quite a challenge. And then thinking about emerging technologies or enabling technologies outside of the core of the 6G, we talk about distributed ledger technologies, blockchain technologies, quantum computing. Bringing these into picture, the question is that should the platforms of the future be centralized? Even if nowadays we talk about multi-sided platforms, that they are not kind of, but still very centralized and controlled by key players in the platform economy. But how about in the future, using these new technologies, we really create the distributed platforms with no focal firm controlling, and then the value is distributed as well as the value is captured by all the stakeholders of the ecosystem. So this is as well interesting topic to study.
I agree that is a very, very relevant topic, because centralization versus decentralization is one of the major paradigms and architectural choices that we'll have to make, which impacts everything around which value can be created by whom and where, and the governance of that. However, I'm thinking about most of the platform approaches that we see today are actually centralized platforms, by the way, except perhaps the few that are around blockchain, and that may be applied not only in the cryptocurrencies, but also perhaps in things like digital euro or so. But even there, you may wonder whether it will not ultimately get centralized. But so decentralization is, I think, also very ambitious to do that, and it's probably a good thing to continue stressing it. Otherwise, we are going down the centralization path unavoidably, and there is no way back, because this is a choice in the beginning. Now, one thing that I find striking, if you look also at today's more centralized platforms, they are offering ever more value. You know, they are integrating artificial intelligence for your data analytics. Of course, they're offering traditional cloud services. They are offering security and buying up ever more security services and identity, and you go on and on and on. So the one thing that, so there's already actually really a lot happening around data and data management, and I can only see that continue becoming ever more intense towards 5G++ and 6G. The thing that seems to not be there is actually getting the right data at the right moment in time. And that is actually something that 6G should enable, because you should be able to get the data that you need now to answer your question in a very transparent way for you as a business user or as a governmental user. You have to be able to get the right data at the right moment in time through, in some way or another, through the network and the sensors that are connected to that, or perhaps the back-to-back between the physical part and the digital twin part. So I guess that could be actually an interesting new kind of service to develop. And that is close also to those people that will provide intermediary network services. I don't know if that is a path that you also would see developing, but I can imagine that here with the let's take the extreme case, for example, of the battleground, and you're running a 6G network on a battleground. There you will have a very high variability of, you need to have the data very quickly. You have a high variability of where the inputs are coming from, the conditions and the quality of the data, the conditions and the quality of the network. It's an extreme case to test some of the vision that we have around 6G.
Very good. Paul?
To add very briefly to that, for me, it's not so much a question of either or, centralized versus decentralized. It depends on the purpose, I would say. There will be, and picking up on the example which Paul just mentioned, I think there will be a lot of decentralized capabilities and demand on a battleground, which cannot be managed centrally. But if you want to have consistent data sets, you need a centralized unit as well. So it's not either or, it's both depending on the purpose.
Yeah, I think that we have now had on purpose a little bit leading question. This platform thinking leads us to think in terms of a system. And I think it's a very good point from Paul to talk about the services. And I think that this service orientation of things, especially from the users' needs on demand, whatever it is one idea that could be there in the future. The problem is that we are lacking this kind of business models in the background that would allow flexible reconfiguration of things at the system level, so that users, whatever they are, whether they are machines or humans, could get what they want. So I think that this platform, 6G and AI thinking come together, and these issues like what Seppo was mentioning about the blockchain, so tools that help us to keep the privacy, security, safety things arranged while we are enjoying the services is important. But I think that we are really kind of trying to, at the moment, get a very big picture of everything into one single discussion. It's hard, and we have a moving target that we are trying to hit here with 6G, so that makes it even a little bit more hard. Now the question would be probably this, that how should we approach or frame this question of 6G for the developers, for the regulators, for the service users? So what would be the perspectives from which to look this transition? What's your view on this? What kind of views we should take to make sense of this change?
To start with, Petri, at least reading 6G white papers, they are now popping like mushrooms in Finland. So I think what's common that with previous Gs, we were very focused on key performance indicators, that it's 10 times or 100 times the performance, whether it's the speed or latency or how many nines. But now with 6G in many white papers and blogs and others, we talk about values, key value indicators. And that's visible as well in whether it's a Japan or US or European funded large project, we talk about value indicators, and at least that's one framework. And what's closely related to values is this sustainability development goals from United Nations, where there's 17 altogether. That gives a very kind of broad perspective of different values, and that is one way of trying to cope with the value indicators.
Very good.
Yeah, perhaps adding to that, I think indeed it's a good idea to keep, let's say, value indicators around SDGs and in particular SDGs, because they have been phrased as such, to keep them ahead of us and as kind of a reference point. Nevertheless, we should not deny that there are big contradictions also between these values. The values of, as we see that also today, what is your individual freedom versus collective responsibility, collective rights and responsibilities. And of course, the SDGs to an extent mask that. The SDGs will not go into the debate about, for example, democratic values that we find very important, individual data protection versus the collective, the common good, those kind of things. So I think we will have to have a hard discussion, and I don't believe that we can be very optimistic that taking SDGs will unite the planet around a common approach on 6G. I don't think that's going to happen. We should also not avoid that discussion, because by avoiding it, as the argument that we have made before, we are going to unavoidably be dragged into a certain type of solution which is technology determined, because then the technology choices are made before we actually have this value discussion. So I think it's excellent that we have conferences like this where we can put such questions on the table. There is one more element to the SDGs. SDGs is actually a very inclusive effort. You know, it's a multi-stakeholder effort. It brings everybody around the table. I think it's also not bad as a 6G community to look at ourselves and say, are we inclusive enough? Do we have everybody around the table, also those whose rights may get affected in the future and who are perhaps not so articulate as we as participants to these type of debates are in the various issues around policy, regulation, and technology.
Very good. I was also thinking about the regulatory logic here. Do you, George, have something to think from the perspective of regulation? That how should we actually change the way how we regulate telcos, digitalization in the future?
No, that's a very important point, Petri, actually. And I recently published an article on my website highlighting the necessary paradigm shift in regulation to cope with the challenges ahead. And for me, I mean, I was always intrigued by the fact that there is Moore's law, which is a pacemaker for the development of the digital sector. And how can a regulatory system, a legal system, cope with the massive speed of technological advances? So I think regulation, the way it's exercised, it needs certainly change from static traditional regulation towards an anticipative principle-based regulation. And anticipatory regulation is a new approach that is proactive, iterative, and responsive to evolving markets, to evolving technologies, and is certainly better suited to keep pace with such an environment which is driven by Moore's law. And it emphasizes flexibility, collaboration, and innovation. And it's built on 6 principles, which in many ways contrast with the regulatory traditional practice, which regulators are doing all over the globe. So it's inclusive and collaborative in engaging public and diverse stakeholders, as Paul mentioned, where new technologies and how they are deployed raise ethical issues or leveraging the capabilities of business. It's future-facing in developing resilient, adaptive strategies that can cope with the inherent uncertainty of fast-changing markets. It's proactive in engaging with innovators and innovation early in the cycle to provide predictability. And it's iterative in taking a test and involve rather than solve and leave approach to novel problems. It's outcome-based in focusing on validating companies' efforts in achieve well-defined goals rather than setting rules in advance, and particularly on incentivizing platforms to support regulatory objectives. And it's experimental in facilitating diverse responses to regulation of early-stage opportunities and risks, and where national or global policies and standards are still to be established. So I think that's a massive change which is necessary to cope with the regulatory challenges on the one hand, and to enable and foster innovation on the other hand. Not that regulation becomes a blocker to innovation.
Very good. I think that we have had a very good discussion on these issues, and I think that I have one question before we go into these questions from the audience, and that would be related to this regulation and change, but especially to the sovereignty of the countries and the geopolitical challenges that we are facing in this development of the 6G solutions. So what do you think, what do you see as the key things we should address when we are talking about these developments at the global level, geopolitics, regulation, standardization, as such?
Hey, Petri, one thing has not been discussed in this panel is the spectrum issue, the real estate of radio engineers and the bloodline of the industry, and it's really like I mentioned that 6G will be a long tail game, that there will be thousands of millions of different use cases and users, and no one knows what the killer app will be, but the technology and the platforms and ecosystem should be ready for that, and based on this long tail story, you have to democratize the tools of production to make this. And what's the tool of production in this industry? It's the spectrum. And that's something that how we innovate the spectrum regulation and policy globally to make it more flexible, agile, and then on national and government level and very local level. And now we see that is it altogether something like 32 countries globally who are working or already has kind of launched this local licensing of spectrum, that you can get spectrum to your manufacturing plant, your campus, your farm, your community. And this is already kind of one innovation in itself, kind of really creating new businesses. And this is, I think that's something we will discuss later, but how it not only enables rural connectivity for villages, combined with the satellites and this kind of 3D networks with airborne drones and others. So there's a lot of innovation in that space, and now we see that positive momentum in policymakers, but not all countries, not all regions.
Very good point. The spectrum issue has been in the background of our discussion, of course, but not at the surface. Very good point. And it's really a kind of national issue to decide this kind of things. But there's also a lot of coordination that needs to be there at the country level or between countries, so that we can reach the critical mass for the opportunities to emerge from this.
Petri, may I jump on this, because this is close to my heart, this issue. Is it a national issue or is it a European issue? And let me start with a little anecdote. The Director General of DG Connect of the European Commission, Mr. Roberto Viola, he said in 2016, when the European Electronic Communications Code was just in discussion, we have done a horrible job in 4G licensing in Europe, because the way how spectrum has been awarded, the time when spectrum has been awarded, the type of spectrum which has been awarded was so fragmented in Europe. So we have to do better in 5G. And then the European Commission came up with an idea to more Europeanize spectrum policy, to make it more a European issue and not so much a national issue. And the outcome of that was quite sobering, because the end of the story was when the European Electronic Communications Code was set in stone, every nation does its own thing. And I think European spectrum policy is far from being a European issue. It remained a national thing. And the outcome is quite clear. If you have a look at the 5G Observatory, which is this monitoring tool from the European Commission, it shows the last issue was mid of this year. It shows Europe is far from being a global leader in spectrum licensing. It's number 2 for low band, below 1 gigahertz. It's number 4 in mid band, behind US, China, South Korea, and Japan. And it's again number 4 in high band microwave. And that is not a global leader. And that's because it's a fragmented national issue, and we are far away from a digital single market.
And that's also one of the reasons why I think that this geopolitical thinking has a lot it influences a lot this discussion, and it's this competition of the blocks, and we have a role to play, and how we can improve. That's a message to Europe, I think. Very good point.
If I don't know if you still want to go on that point of the geopolitical and sovereignty question, just briefly, Petri. I think you can see that with 5G, there are now attempts to in a certain sense, to fragment it again, to capture lost ground, geopolitically lost ground, to recapture that. And so there are new architectural approaches that allow for that. And I think this is a trend that we cannot ignore for 6G. I've written an article that says if we do not resolve the sovereignty challenges in 5G, we will not have a global 6G. And probably it is wise for the community to think about it, how can you envisage a 6G that perhaps has some aspects that are strongly under national security and give national safeguards that are very close to the heart of state-level sovereignty. What are some of the aspects of 6G that could fit very well with, for example, Europeanized approaches? So approaches where you talk about partnerships with like-minded partners. And what are the parts of 6G where you can really and truly talk about global solutions? By spelling it out, we first of all know where the priorities are for working together globally. We could also decide then to reinforce the way we work together globally. For example, I've argued there should be a better visibility of having governments at the table and the role that they play, so that it is not only industry-led, with perhaps governments behind it in a hidden form. And then we can also invest in that global collaboration to hopefully expand the space that is covered by global solutions so that we get the full benefits of global solutions. But I don't think we should be banking or betting on purely global 6G only as the outcome.
Okay, very good. I think that it's time to move on to the next stage of the discussion and let room for the audience for the questions that they have shared in the chat. So, very good. Would you open up it a bit bigger and from the beginning? So, where shall we start? All right. So this first question from Ari Pouttu. Vertical industries are the opportunity rich targets of 5G and 6G. However, we are seeing rather mild vertical industries engagement, envisioning requirements and setting for them for 5G++ and 6G. Any ideas on how to accelerate this involvement of the industries?
I would also be keenly interested to get an answer to that question from the perspective of, we may not call it a vertical industry, but actually the perspective of government involvement, but now government as a buyer. Because we are often talking about private-public partnerships, and we are increasingly talking about the role of government as a lead customer or as a procurer of innovation. And in particular, we have seen that, of course, also with efforts around 5G pilots. We see it in the European research programs that it is promoted for 5G and 6G. So what are the areas where government actually can be in the lead as a customer? We refer to one possible one, what would be defense, but defense is, of course, a very special kind of vertical sector, to call it that way. which other areas are there where governments could usefully play a role as a lead customer, and perhaps then indeed also be a lead customer, not only as a buyer of the innovation, but as we have argued, the operator of the innovation may be the business user themselves. So will governments actually be also in that position of becoming the business user? Or is that not something that we should hope for or demand from governments?
Yeah, it could be that the local practices in different countries are different regarding how to involve these firms into different kind of partnerships, and that may also be one of these bottlenecks. In EU, we have programs that can promote that kind of things, but that also needs the real interest of the companies to enter into these programs and see the benefits that are there. Very good.
Let me mention one example. So Europe, for example, is also promoting the concept of European data spaces. And European data spaces are in various areas, including public administrations, but also, for example, environmental data spaces. Well, they are very closely linked to circular economy. Circular economy must be very closely linked to 6G. And so what is the role of that kind of platform, or whatever you would call it, in a European environmental data space that can also be fed by data coming from many monitoring sites, many sensors, many connected networks, and that European data space may perhaps ultimately be run perhaps by a private consortium, I don't know, or by a private-public partnership, but for sure there will be a big role for governments to stimulate that.
Very good. Seppo and George, do you have something?
Coming back to this vertical question, very good question on the chat, and I work very closely with enterprises and verticals, and being in radio conference. So how many radio engineers typical factory have on premises, or how many data engineers or telecom engineers? Typically none, or it's fully outsourced. And the key problem is that we don't have a common language. If you try to sell 6G or connectivity to a factory, that's not what they want. They want a kind of solution to a problem they have, and it's much higher layer. So that's one challenge, and luckily we have a lot of kind of different programs in Europe, in US, in Asia, where bringing together different stakeholders. We have different alliances, like in Europe, 5G ACIA, trying to bring together the telecom people and operation technology people representing the manufacturing industry, and this takes time. And luckily, we are now practicing it with 5G towards 6G. Or then we are trying to sell even a content or data, but even that is kind of too low a layer for many verticals. They have a practical problem to solve, and even digital twin. Hey, what is digital twin? I have to solve. I have to improve my productivity, efficiency, employee safety. And so it's really starting from this common culture and language.
Picking up on Seppo's point, that's a very valid point. So imagine a large industrial plant, whatever is, or a refinery or whatsoever. So would they then go to a telecom operator and ask him to build the network and operate the network, maybe? Or will they go to Nokia, Ericsson, or whoever and say, okay, please build that for us? Or would they go to Microsoft or to Google and say, let's do that? So who is the one who will be called by the verticals? I think there is no definite answer to this question, because it's all evolving matters. But it's a very interesting one.
Yeah, it is a very good question. That's also a thing that we've been researching for several years, and we have different kind of answers, potential answers to that, but then no definite yet, I think. Very good. Thank you. Then we have another question by Matti Latva. Would you, Matti, like to ask the question yourself? Oh, it seems that maybe bad connection. So Matti's question is that a mobile telco business has been frozen some time with well-established infrastructure providers and strong operators that are both very strong behind the scenes, also in the regulation. So is there a real need to try to change this dominance? And if so, how the new entrants could be encouraged to start investing in building the necessary future digital society with increasingly diversified needs for services offered in different locations? So how to break the dominance? Is there a need for it? And how to help the entrants to come into play?
Perhaps two suggestions from my side. So indeed, I think there's a really good point in this question about who until now has been determining essentially the scene, including standardization, and have they been how have they been operating, what has been the outcome. And I would contend that actually what we have seen happening in 3G, 4G, 5G cannot continue. 5G is not in that sense really a success of the established parties in what they have achieved. You know, governments didn't like what they have produced and they had to, in a certain sense, backtrack, and that backtracking is still happening. That's not the model to continue. So there's certainly one party that is not at the table sufficiently, which is governments in the right shape and form, and I know it's delicate to talk about it. The other could be actually, when talking about these verticals, we might suitably look at stronger involvement, stronger place at the table for those that are representing verticals globally. Why? Because I think in many cases, wherever we can end up with global solutions, that might actually have the preference. So let me mention one vertical that we might involve is perhaps healthcare. So public health, global health, and we know it's a global challenge, has many needs for future networks and connectivity and sensors, information exchange. Actually, all of these things that we have said in ICTs about 6G might very well be suitable in order to cope with future pandemics. Let me just mention one of those that we have. And actually, we may be in not too bad a position to involve the health industry in this, because the health industry also is, to an extent, internationally organized. And there's even an international body, the World Health Organization, who helps us and to deal with global health challenges. Are they at the table in our discussions? And if they are not, I think we should invite them, even if it is just an example of a vertical.
Very good point. George and Seppo, something what you'd like to add here? All right, if not, then we have a next question from Aribot also. So meeting the sustainability targets, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, they would require global internet connectivity. And now half of the world population is connected. So what type of business models do you foresee to provide at least frugal internet connectivity to the unconnected in developing or remote areas?
No, I think that's a very important thing. And of course, the LEO satellite constellations, which are now mushrooming everywhere, mostly driven by the big platform billionaires. So I think that's an interesting question, whether these services, these LEO constellations with thousands and thousands of satellite in low orbit will be the ultimate solution for providing really global ubiquitous connectivity. It's still unproven. We will see. The price you have to upfront pay for the equipment and the monthly fee is still not competitive with traditional mobile connectivity or landline connectivity. But they promised, Elon Musk promised enormous decreases in the price. We will see that, but on the other hand, we know that astronomers are complaining a lot because of the negative effects on scientific research in astronomy. It's a lot of discussion about space debris and many other things. The earlier projects with balloons and stratospheric platforms have not, I mean, they sound nice, but they have all been ditched after a while. So we'll see whether, besides traditional mobile networks and landline connectivity, satellites will bring the solution for global connectivity. But I think it's an option, but it's still unproven.
Good.
To build on George's comments on the technology side and the connectivity, so I've been lately involved in many projects, for instance, in Africa and South America. And my key learning is that this, from business model point of view, like the question was, it's really about multi-tenancy, that not a single use case or business is capable of creating enough value or capture to kind of justify the investments for connectivity. But when combining several different businesses or business models and users, whether it's a village or community or municipal, then it typically starts making sense. And once again, I'm kind of repeating myself, but it's not just connectivity, but think about what business you can make on the content, what business you can make on the context, and then the commerce. And in many times when combining different businesses in all these 4C models, then it starts making sense, whether it's then the connectivity provided by satellite or mobile networks. And coming back as well, these tools of production, then it's the cost of the spectrum, and huge amount of innovation is put on how to create connectivity outside of mobile network operators' turf. And that leads back to this policy question or regulatory question, that if the spectrum is unused in rural areas or connecting the next billion, it's really a policy question and policy problem more than a technology in many cases.
Very good. Paul, something you'd like to share on this?
Well, no particular views on this one, no. Thank you.
All right, very good. I think that we have room for more questions from the audience, so please do not hesitate to write your questions on the chat, or alternatively, just raise your hands and then the session chair can grant you the opportunity to ask the question, also personally. So there's one question from Maria. Maria, do you want to ask yourself? Okay, if not, then I will read it. So do you have suggestions on how European level spectrum decisions could be made to make Europe a global leader and avoid the fragmentation we are seeing in 5G? So how to make Europe great again?
It's about distribution of competencies. I mean, we have a well-functioning system of coordinating spectrum globally, but that's under the ITU auspices. But we are very poor in Europe, or to be more precise, within the European Union, to centralize, or a little bit more centralize, spectrum policies. It's completely in the hands of each and every member state in the Union. I mean, there's of course a short-sighted argument. It's about the auction proceeds, who will gather the auction proceeds. But interestingly, even when the European Commission made the proposal, let's centralize or more centralize spectrum awarding and coordinate better the timing and the type of spectrum which is being awarded to the players, every member state can keep its part or its share from the auction proceeds. Even that was rejected by the member states. So the basic question, it boils down to this basic question, like in many other areas. Do we want to have more Europe or less Europe? And in this part, we're still on the side, okay, we want to have a digital single market, but we don't give up any of our competencies, national competencies. And that's a deadlock. We will not improve if we are not able to resolve this deadlock.
Very good. Paul and Seppo, something to comment?
Maybe to add the technology side of the story, being in this conference, that like we see what's happening in US with US CPRS spectrum sharing technology, or local 5G in Japan, new initiatives in China and Korea. So in Europe as well, maybe we should put more effort on spectrum sharing and cognitive radio technologies, knowing that even if we are able to build a kind of harmonized spectrum regulation, we have it scalable and replicable and it's sustainable kind of, but still there will be a lot of legacy users and a lot of kind of incumbents in various spectrum bands, but really then have innovations on how to share the spectrum in a more efficient way, and how to mitigate interference, how to develop better receivers. And how this relates to businesses, then we talk a lot about this sharing economy. So how to build sharing economy into 6G. In sharing spectrum, like we have discussed, sharing different virtualized network assets through the slicing and open interfaces and virtualization and cloud, but really build this as well into spectrum. And I encourage us to put more effort on that research side.
Yeah, let me add to that.
Yeah.
Indeed, I think also, Seppo, that looking here at technological solutions may be one of the ways forward to take this thing out of it. And in parallel, perhaps also learning from other areas where ultimately we are able at European level to do a degree of sharing. So let's the area of cybersecurity, for example, where everybody says don't touch that because that's national security. Well, we are a little bit beyond that point now, because everybody realizes that you are sitting only on your national security and don't collaborate. Actually, you are undermining your national security. And so you have to collaborate in order to not get undermined nationally. You cannot quite make the same argument here for spectrum, but we might also be looking at other areas like environmental carbon pollution. You know, we've got systems of carbon credits. Well, think about something analogous. Can you have something like spectrum credits that will be technologically supported, that allow us to do joint policy? I agree with Georg that, if we continue to talk in the environments of established telecom ministries and ministries of finance, we are going to go again into the same discussions in the past. So we need to be creative and offer ways out, technological ways out, and let's say policy innovations as a way out. Perhaps it fits in the anticipatory regulatory approach that Georg was advocating.
And to add also on what Seppo said a bit about the technical or technological ways of sharing spectrum, sharing economy, that's a very interesting part. The problem is, or the complication of this is, that there are regulators and general competition authorities. They have also a say in that. We had seen many fields or many examples when operators agreed on sharing spectrum with the okay coming from the regulatory authority, and then afterwards from behind, so to say, the competition authority, national competition authority came and said, you're not allowed to do that because that would block the competition in your country and things like this. So if we don't have regulatory and competition certainty, that's a blocker for such things. And that's a very important part of it.
Okay, very good. Thank you. There's still time for questions from the audience. So, and now you can also open up your mic and just ask the question. So do we have questions from the audience? It seems that there's no questions from the audience. Well, it's not too late. I think that we are going towards the end of the panel. I have one final question for the panelists. So, what kind of regards or message you'd like to give to the mobile community or industry for developing 6G in the future? Who would like to start? What is your
Perhaps
key
if
message?
I can give just two messages. One is ensure that there is a wide involvement of all of the parties that will ultimately have a stake in 6G, and so take an active effort to have a wide involvement. And the second is being very sensitive to the fact that choices that we are going to make for technology are not going to be neutral. They really determine and are closely linked to the values of the future.
Thank you. George and Seppo.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point Paul raised here. From my side, I would add only one thing. We need a new approach in regulation. And I've dealt with that very intensively in an article I recently published on my website. I shared the link in the chat. It's important. Otherwise, if we don't have a new regulatory paradigm, a new way to regulate things from static regulation to anticipatory regulation, we will not be successful in managing the transition from 5G to 6G in a way that is positive for all stakeholders.
Very good. And Seppo.
Thanks, Petri. I would like to conclude that like studying business models, and we agree that what kind of business model is successful, and the successful business should scale, it should replicate, and it should be sustainable, and not just economically sustainable, but as well socially and environmentally. So let's focus on that.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I think that we have still one last question from the audience. This is from Ari Pouttu. So he's asking, sensing and imaging are new disruptive capabilities of 6G. And how do you see these from the perspective of this panel?
Petri, I think I discussed this already, that 6G is enormous new sensor. Imaging as a radar, as building the location, positioning information, and producing in itself enormous amount of data. And this data is something we should then monetize, create value, and capture value from this data. And once again, this brings to the regulation and policy, that how telecom industry is regulated compared to how, let's say, web scales or platforms or over-the-top industries are regulated. So let's hope that as an industry, we have a kind of more opportunities to monetize that data and build kind of very innovative business models on top of this data 6G will generate in itself.
Paul and George, do you want to add something on this?
No comments from my side. No.
No comments from me either.
All right. Thank you very much. So I think that we have come to the end of the discussion, and I think that we have had a very diverse and very enlightening discussion around 6G businesses, the opportunities, the positive and negative sides of the discussion, bottlenecks, and maybe even trying to find out a framework in this discussion, how to kind of approach the problem of how to make profitable business from the innovations that 6G will bring about. And I really want to thank you all for the discussion and the contributions that you provided. I think we've all enjoyed the show, and I also want to thank the audience for the questions. And I hope that this panel on the dawn of the 6G business and are we facing a positive disruption is showing way to developing 6G into a positive disruption in this business. But I think we are ready to close. Thank you.
Thank you, Petri.
Bye.
It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.